Hello friends and welcome back to my second channel, Katie one more time. Today we are here to do my October reading wrap up. I know we missed out on my reading wrap up last month, and that is because I only read 3 books and I didn't feel like I had enough to say to make up a whole video. October though has been a much better month. I read 14 books. So before I talk about all of the books that I read, let's have a quick look at the stats. And all of these come from the story graph. So between my 14 books, I read 3,193 pages. My biggest category for moods were emotional, lighthearted, informative, adventurous, and reflective. Now for pace, this one is actually a big change from what I normally read, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is later. Only 15% of the books that I read were slow-paced books, 38% were medium, and 46, almost half, were fast-paced. Now for the length of my books, 77% were under 300 pages, 23% were between 300 and 500. I didn't read any books longer than 500 pages. 77% of the books that I read are considered fiction, 23 non-fiction. Genres is the other place where we see a big change from my previous reading months. My biggest genres were fantasy, children's, graphic novels, middle grade, young adult, philosophy, and literary. Now my average star rating across the 14 books is actually very high. It's 3.86. I have 2 books each for 2 and 3 star, and then 6 books in the 4-star category and 4 in the 5. This time I decided not to do half-star marks. I don't know, I feel like things get complicated when I do half-star marks. So some of these are sort of rounded up, some of them are rounded down, but it gives you a good idea. Okay, now briefly on why my reading has changed so much this month from previous. That is because I got offered a new job. It was quite unexpected. I sort of was looking for a new job, but the job I ended up getting was not one I had ever considered. And that was, I've started working in a children's bookstore here in Melbourne. It's very exciting. It's also terrifying because I definitely don't feel like I know a whole lot about children's literature. I enjoy graphic novels, I enjoy manga, I enjoy middle grade fiction from time to time, but I don't feel like, I know the lay of the land very well. So as a result, I've been trying to read more and more children's books. So if you follow me over on GoodReads and you were wondering why towards the end of the month I was pumping out children's books, that's why. As per usual, I'm going to go through all of the books that I read in order of star rating. So these videos often start out quite negative but end very positive, so stay around if you want to hear about the books that I really loved. So let's start with the 2-star reads. I have 2 books in this category. The first is The Hen Who Dreamed She Could Fly by Sun Mi Huang. So this is one I picked up on a bit of a whim. We got it in at the TS bookshop, which is the bookshop I've been working at for the last few years. It was in our very small fiction section. And I don't know, to me, I thought this was going to be a charming, sentimental sort of allegory on life. That sort of thing. And perhaps it could have been that if it were a 30-page picture book rather than a 130-page novella. For me, this was slow and tedious, and ultimately, if you like any form of subtlety in your books, you will not find it here. This was so heavy-handed. It's basically the story about a hen who is living in a very small cage. She lays eggs, the farmer comes and takes them every day, and she's miserable. She's in this tiny little cage all by herself to produce eggs. She's so miserable that she stops eating, and she finally gets to the point where the farmer decides that she's not being productive enough, she's not worth keeping. So she's taken out to be killed. She's sort of dumped in a mass burial ground for hens who aren't laying enough eggs anymore. She manages to survive this ordeal, and she has had this lifelong dream of having her own egg that she gets to keep, that she gets to lay on, and that she gets to see hatch. Basically, she's desperate to be a mother. She ends up finding an egg sort of left by itself in the middle of nowhere, and she's just drawn to sitting on it. She protects it, she looks after it, and after a while it does hatch. Mild spoilers, but the egg she's laying on is not a chicken egg, ends up being a duckling. And so she ends up raising this duckling as her own, and that's basically the story. So like I said, the themes and the messaging just felt so heavy-handed. And on top of that, the way that motherhood is sort of, spoken about and explored in this just felt really reductive to me. It just felt very much like this hen had no purpose in life unless she was a mother. And that was her entire existence. Nothing about her or her desires mattered outside of being a mother. And ultimately, it just completely lacked the charm and the warmth that I was expecting and hoping for when I picked this up. Next is a book I read on my Kindle at the recommendation of my friend Sammy Menzo. And this was the first in the Wandi Darling series by Colleen Oakes. So it's sort of supposed to be a retelling or a reimagining of the Peter Pan story, which is something I've always really loved. I never liked Peter Pan himself, but the idea of Neverland and never growing up and all of that sort of stuff always really appealed to me as a kid. So recommended by a friend about a story that I love. I was so excited about this. And I'm not usually a huge fan of YA. There are certainly YA books that I do love, but It's not a genre that I consistently enjoy, and same goes for fantasy. So the two things coming together, it's certainly maybe not the most obvious book for me to love, but I do love subversive reimaginings and retellings of old stories and myths. For example, I really liked The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I really loved The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood. So I remained optimistic. However, despite being told from Wendy's perspective, this book offered no subversion to the original story. If anything, it just adds more misogyny, as well as a bunch of really unnecessary mental health stigma. And now, instead of just being a brat, Peter Pan is a fully fledged cult leader and rapist. It was very quick and easy to read, so that's the only reason I gave it 2 stars instead of 1. And Sammy does assure me that books 2 and 3 do subvert the story a whole lot more, sort of introduce some more complex elements, and I don't know, this whole rapey Peter Pan thing does make sense. But as for my reading experience of this book, I hated it. Sorry, Sammy. Now for our 3-star books. The first is, I've heard this pronounced so many different ways and I don't know which is correct. I've heard it arboretum, I don't know. Trees and Shit, basically, by David Byrne. Yes, the David Byrne from Talking Heads. This is a book I got recently in like this big mystery book box from the book grocer that my friend Annie sent me. Even though I sort of have very mixed feelings about it, I have to say this is one of the books that I have enjoyed sort of exploring with other people in my life more than I have any other book for quite a while. I think because it's one of those ones that you can just like show a friend and be like, what do you think this means? Like, let's talk about it. It's very engaging and it invites a lot of conversation and just like exploration of ideas. I haven't really even explained what this is, and that's because it's kind of, I don't even know what it is. It's basically a bunch of drawings, mostly of trees. They're sort of diagrams. They're sort of like thought experiments using trees and like brain dumps, like mind maps with different concepts. Each has a title down here, which sort of gives you an idea of like what the point is, I guess. And a lot of them do also have a brief explanation in the back of the book. So why was this a weird book? Well, I mean, it's a weird concept by a bit of a weird dude to begin with. And I suppose it's one of those things where some of these felt really brilliant. They felt like they were exploring ideas and concepts in new ways. Most of them just felt like kind of pretentious bullshit though, where it was sort of like, am I just not smart enough to figure this out? Or is this just a load of shit? But overall, I did have quite a lot of fun going through this. I don't know, it was a weird time. And I guess at the end of the day, I've never read a book like it. However, there were a few questionable trees, but one in particular, which is called One World, it's number 12, is literally just a tree with roots that are not labelled. The branches, however, are all labelled with different racial slurs. And this is one of the few diagrams that does not have an explanation in the back, and if any required an explanation from a white dude writing racial slurs in a book, I feel like that was it. I'm assuming this had some kind of point or message because there was nothing else in the book that made me think that he's just like a racist or something, but like I don't know what to make of it, and I don't really like that it's in there. Maybe it's that these things don't have roots, they don't have substance. But is that just me sort of making that assumption because that's my like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know what to make of it from his point of view. I don't know why it was included. And now for the 4-star books. One I read earlier in the month is She is Haunted by Paige Clark. This is an Australian debut. It's a collection of short stories, and I received this in my recent Wild Book Box. There are some very specific themes and recurring motifs, so this collection felt very cohesive. There's even some characters that, even though they're not explicitly the same character or maybe not explicitly related, there's sort of a suggestion that they are across stories. So the stories, yeah, they feel all interconnected even if they're not explicitly so, if that makes sense. Some of the big main themes explored were things like mother-daughter relationships, Asian identity and experience, womanhood, marriage, morality, and capitalism. Some of these were very character focused, others were more like exploring an idea, like there was sort of one near future dystopia, like late stage capitalist thing where like people were getting sort of lobotomized to better handle extreme weather conditions. And even though that might not have been my favorite story whilst reading, that is actually the one that definitely has stuck with me because it was such an interesting concept and done in a very like small and haunting way. And this is actually the first book that I've read that mentions the pandemic. There's no like stories that are solely focused on the pandemic. There's just a few that sort of are like mention it or mention lockdowns. And it's the first time I'm reading that in print. And so it was sort of a surreal experience, if I'm honest. As with all short story collections, there were some short stories in here that I enjoyed more than others. But at the end of the day, there wasn't any that I really disliked or didn't enjoy at all. So it felt like a very well-rounded, substantial collection. And it has definitely made me interested in what else Paige Clarke puts out in the future. Then our latest Blossom Book Club read was At the Existentialist Cafe, Freedom Being an Apricot Cocktails by Sarah Bakewell. And even though I did find this quite difficult and slow to get through, I also really enjoyed it. Basically, this is sort of like a biography history lesson mixed in with the existential ideas of all like the main existentialist thinkers and writers of like the early to mid 20th century. Philosophy is not something I know a lot about, and I certainly didn't know much about the existentialists, their thoughts, or who they were. So I found this very interesting. Although some of the concepts and stuff I did find a little bit confusing, and sometimes I confused like who we were talking about. There is like a handy guide of the characters, which I did find helpful, and I did reference quite a lot when I got confused about who was who. And even though I don't feel like I understood everything, I really enjoyed this little history lesson of learning about how like the 20th century sort of progressed and the sort of ideas that people were talking about and why, and how existentialism sort of came to be, and then how it tried to answer the big questions of the 20th century. So it was a challenging read for me, but not one that I didn't feel was like so difficult that it wasn't worth my time. I do feel like this is something I might like to read again in the future and spend more time with. Because it was a book club, there was sort of a deadline on when I needed to finish it, and I feel like this is a book that I would rather read a lot more slowly. But I found it really interesting, and I really liked like the way that we learnt about so many people as well as their ideas, and how they sort of tried to, or sometimes failed to, live their ideas. I don't know, it was really interesting. I liked it a lot. At least for me and my very uneducated viewpoint on the topic, I felt like it was about as simple, clear, and as accessible as it could be, while still being thorough and staying true to the people and the source material. Now, an audiobook that I listened to this month was Vesper Flights by Helen McDonald. I got this audiobook through Libro FM's ALC program, so thank you to Libro FM for that. And Helen McDonald was the narrator of the audiobook, and it was beautiful. I actually feel like this is a book that I could have like adored if I'd spent more like intentional time reading it. But what this was for me as an audiobook was largely something that I would put on when I was going for walks, especially when I was feeling a bit anxious last month, because I found it so soothing. It was also super interesting and very engaging, but I don't know that I gave it as much attention as it deserved, I guess. The book features lots of different essays that essentially explored the human world and the natural world, and I think in so many ways, Helen seeks to sort of blur the supposed distinctions between the two. And ultimately, I felt like she was really encouraging us to view animals and their natural habitats in new ways. She spoke a lot about environmentalism and the climate crisis, but also spoke about very small moments with particular animals and how they impacted her and learning about them. And I don't know, there was just something really beautiful to her nature writing, and I would like to read more from her. Another ebook that I read this month was Exit Strategy, which is the 4th book in the Murderbot Diaries by Martha Wells. And I don't know that this is my favorite installment in the series, but it was still so good and it was still so Murderbot that I still loved it. And at this point for me, I feel like the series as a whole is like greater than the sum of its parts. Like each book might not be like a 10 out of 10 book, but like overall it's just such an enjoyable ride. This series just makes me so happy, and I think the way that Martha Wells has sort of contrasted the very dark, grim look at the future of this kind of really extreme version of capitalism that has kind of taken hold in much of the galaxy, I guess. And yet somehow it still feels so fun. And I think that has so much to do with the character of Murderbot itself. I think it's one of my favorite characters that I've ever read. Murderbot is so good. Then one of the kids' books that I read this month was Amulet. I think it's the series Amulet, and this is the first book called The Stone Keeper. The first 12 pages of this are so hard-hitting. Like, I cried. I'm not even kidding. In the first 12 pages, we have a very explicit death scene of a parent. Then we jump forward in time and we're left with the single mum and her 2 children, and they just can't afford to live in the city anymore. So they're moving out to this old abandoned house that sort of has been in the family for a long time. And it's a bit spooky, and there they discover an amulet, which has a bunch of powers. The mother gets captured and taken away by this weird monster thing, and the brother and sister have to go on like a journey to try and save her. I did quite enjoy this, and the art is really beautiful. I think the reason that I didn't love it is because, at least for book one, it felt like the kids they didn't do a whole lot. It was the amulet sort of doing everything. Towards the end of the book though, it is sort of established that maybe this amulet isn't all that it seems to be, and there's a lot more questions than there are answers. So I don't know, I'm sort of like, I definitely want to read book two, but it could kind of go either way for me, I think. It did evoke a sense of atmosphere very well though. It's quite spooky. Then I also read Heartstopper by Alice Oseman, which I know is a well-beloved, almost like a cult classic. Is it even a cult classic at this point? It's huge. Graphic novel about two teenage boys falling in love. It's super sweet, super tender, totally adorable. And I also really liked the way that the book sort of took the time to challenge some really harmful stereotypes about sexuality. I really liked this. I think the only reason that I gave it 4 stars instead of 5 is because, I don't know, it's a graphic novel, so it feels quite short, and I don't feel like I got, I don't know, everything that I wanted, but it is only volume 1, and I definitely want to read volume 2. And if it sort of goes along with the same vibes as this, I'm sure I'll end up, kind of like Murderbot, I'll end up enjoying the series more than I enjoyed individual installments almost, if that makes sense. You sort of just get a really, really good taster, and I definitely want to read the other volumes. And now for my 5-star reads. Now the first one that I read is a Tony Birch book. It's called Blood. This also came to me in the Wild Book Box, so eventually when I finally get through the 3rd book, you will be getting a vlog of me reading this and She is Haunted. But I loved this. This was so easy to read, I could not put it down. I love Tony Birch's writing. I love how colloquial and Australian it is. I love how compelling he makes his stories, and I think the best thing about this book is the character Jesse. Literally within a page or 2, you're in love with him. Like you're invested in him and his journey. It's just so well done. So Jesse is a 13-year-old boy, I think from memory, and he lives with his mother who has a lot of substance abuse issues. She has sort of very tumultuous relationships on and off with different men. And then there's also Rachel, who is Jesse's little sister. They're half siblings, but they love each other very much. All we know about Jesse's father is that he was an Aboriginal man. We don't know anything else. And I think that lack of a male role model in Jesse's life is sort of like a big theme in this book. And him sort of like, I don't know, trying to find a healthy version of masculinity with no role models in his life. During the book, we find out that at some point in the past, Jesse was taken from his mother and put into foster care, and his sister Rachel is terrified of that happening again, especially when she finds out that they're half siblings and not full siblings. And so Blood is about the fact that they sort of do this little blood pact where Jesse promises that they'll never be separated, and he takes that promise to Rachel very seriously. So to put it mildly, their mother is hugely unreliable, and is just like, she's really troubled herself. They move around a lot depending on their mother's situation and circumstance, and depending on if she has a boyfriend at the moment or not. Like their life is all over the place. And the kids are put in some really harmful, dangerous situations. About halfway through the book, the mother gets involved with a man who clearly has quite a dark past and is involved in some quite dangerous activity now. The second half of the book was really intense, and it felt almost like a thriller to me. I don't read thrillers, so I'm not sure how like actually accurate that comparison is, but it was tense and I was on the edge of my seat the entire time. And the heart of it, I guess, is just about a family in an extreme poverty situation and how much that impacts their lives, how they have no stability, they have no certainty, and Jesse in particular has so much responsibility on his shoulders for such a young boy. But at the end of the day, like I said, it was Jesse and his narration, how like raw and childlike, but also uncomfortably mature he was. It was heartbreaking, and Tony Birch is just such an incredible storyteller. Next we have Dragonskin by Karen Foxley, and this is a new release children's book here in Australia. In this we follow a young girl called Pip who finds a baby dragon who is very much injured and on the brink of death. And so we follow her as she tries to nurse this dragon back to health by herself. She's very much isolated. She's living with her mother, who she used to have a good relationship with, but that relationship has sort of broken down since her mother has quite an abusive boyfriend now that lives with them as well. And so a lot of this book is about domestic abuse. I think it's tackled very, very sensitively. It's sort of in the background of the story, just always there. And like when Pip is in her home, just like the tension, you can feel it. This book is also about grief. We find out through the book about a past friendship that Pip had. She had a very, very close friendship with a young boy, and she's sort of not been quite the same since he left. And we find out as the book unfolds what happened to him as well. So it's a beautiful story about friendship, about loss, about grief, about domestic violence, about safety and about healing. And I think one of my other favourite things about the book was how beautifully it evoked a sense of place. This is set in Mount Isa in North Queensland, and the landscape was just beautifully written and incorporated into the story. On top of that, I just really loved the tone. Like the way that it incorporated this very fantastical element of the dragon with like the domestic violence situation. I don't know, it just something about it worked so well. It felt so tender and sweet, but honest and raw. It was just really, really well done. And I just loved it. I loved it. Next we have Wandi, which is another new release children's book here in Australia by Fowell Perrette. I've actually read 2 of this author's sort of like grown-up novels, which I've really liked. One of my favourite Australian books is There Was Still Love by this author. So I was super excited that she came out with a kids book for me to read. And this is actually based on a true story. I did not know that going in. This is all about a dingo cub called Wandi. He's living up in the mountains with his family, and one day he gets snatched by an eagle. At some point the eagle drops him and he gets found by a human. He's scared and obviously he wants to go home, but there's just no way to find his family. So he ends up at a dingo sort of rescue reserve. And the people there are particularly excited to have found him because until they found him, people believed that wild alpine dingoes, which is the kind of dingo that Wandi is, were extinct. So to find a cub is proof that they still exist in the wild. So for those of you outside of Australia, you might not know that dingoes are a native Australian animal. They've been on the continent for at least 8,000 years. We know that. They're hugely intelligent. They're smarter than wolves. They're also very agile. They can climb. They're just really clever, curious creatures. They're also the apex and the largest predator on mainland Australia. So as we know with wolves and with any predator, they're very important to maintaining the sort of balance of the landscape. But dingoes have very much been demonized in Australia. I think a combination of the fact that sometimes they ate sheep, even though sheep aren't that good for them because they're too fatty, and like the mythology around the dingo being more of a pest than anything, even though they're native and hugely necessary, has resulted in a lot of unnecessary killing of dingoes. So this sanctuary that Wandi ends up at is really trying to sort of encourage people to fall in love with dingoes in the same way, you know, koalas or kangaroos are sort of part of the national identity, although we don't take great care of them either. And that's what this book is trying to do too, to challenge so much of the myths and the harmful lies that have been told about dingoes and to help kids fall in love with dingoes and to get invested in their well-being and their survival. It's a beautiful story. It's sad, but it's also hopeful. And at the end, there's actually like a little Q&A with the author. And she even talks about the ways that you can help dingoes. And one of them is a suggestion for kids to, you know, maybe next time they have to do a presentation about Australia or Australian animals, to talk about the dingo and to share the story of Wandi. And even this cover, everything about this book is just beautiful. And then another kid's book, it's Bindi by Curly Saunders. This is a book I've been meaning to read for quite a while. So getting this job at the kids bookshop was the perfect push to finally get around to it. This is a novel written in verse and it is just beautiful. It's all about the 11-year-old Bindi who lives at home with her older brother, younger sister, and her parents. And they have a very tight-knit family relationship, but they also are very connected to their Aboriginal elders in the area as well. And it's just a year in the life of Bindi. She goes through lots of different things, highs and lows. She's great at art, but isn't so good at math. She falls off her horse and breaks her wrist. She finds a black cockatoo that also has a broken wing and they sort of like help each other heal. But then about halfway through, a big bushfire comes through Bindi's town. It's a very extreme fire. It does an awful lot of damage and Bindi's obviously scared, as are all the children and I'm sure the parents as well. But the fire does bring up a lot of questions. Bindi reflects on the fact that she's always been told by her elders that fire is an important tool, that it's a healer, that it's important for, you know, like the germination of a lot of seeds for different plants in Australia. So she's confused. She's been told fire is a good thing and now it's hurting her and her family and, you know, the people around her. And so the old people talk about the fact that, well, fire has been ignored and the old ways have been ignored for so long that fire sort of has to retaliate in this like exaggerated way. And so the conversation in the town shifts to, you know, like incorporating Indigenous knowledge and incorporating the elders and their skills in the maintenance of the land and all of that. So it's quite a broad reaching book, even though it's only very short. There's some beautiful illustrations in here too by Dub Leffler. So I loved this. I mean, of course I did. I gave it 5 stars. Okay, so that is my reading wrap up for the month of October and all of the 14 books that I read this month. I hope you enjoyed hanging out with me and talking books, and I would love to hear in the comments below what books you really enjoyed this month, especially if there's any you would recommend. So thank you so much for watching and I will talk to you next time. So much love. Bye.